All right, welcome to the Bitcoin What Is It presentation. We're your hosts, Matthew,
Melina,
Michael.
Today we're going to be covering a general overview of cryptocurrency in the non-technical form. Then we'll be getting a bit more into the technical topics so that we can understand the upcoming ethical issues. And then we will get into our ethical issues, which are the DAO, Mt. Gox, and Silk Road.
So you don't have to understand technical details to use Bitcoin. Bitcoin is just a currency of the internet. It's similar to the regular currency you're used to, like US currency, the euro. So unlike national currencies, Bitcoin is used by private entities and there is no bank that stands behind it. So with Bitcoin, it's like an open source form of currency.
So the best way that I know of to understand what cryptocurrency is to just understand what currency is. So what is money?
Well, what we know of money as today is that you usually provide some sort of agreed value to someone who will provide you with a service that they could offer. And what we know as money is in paper format. It could be like the dollar bill.
Right. And I mean, in some sense, you could exchange anything as long as people value it. Back in prehistoric days, people used to trade seashells for individual items, things like that. Right now, I think everything is originally staked on gold.
Currency is just an idea, more than anything. And we've evolved to make the trading of vast sums of money a lot easier over time. So originally people would have trade animals, and then it evolved to gold. And then that gold got too heavy to carry because you can't carry all that gold in your pocket. So it moved on to paper bank bills, and then the bank bills eventually moved on to a global system that we have today.
Now
this is the next stage, which is just
with
crypto
advances
online.
of technology, you don't have to carry paper notes, banknotes, or coins. Bitcoin is a virtual form of currency. It's got some benefits to it that our traditional form of currency doesn't have, in that it's not associated with the bank, and
it's not controlled by any single entity. Countries can't print it at a whim. So the eventual goal with Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in general is to replace money as we know it. And you can avoid situations like Venezuela, for instance, where their currency, because of the lack of any sort of actual backing, became so low value that people literally have to carry wagons full of money to buy even the smallest of things. By creating something that's a more global currency, something that's more stable, or something that we can all value, we might be able to make a system that works for everyone.
Yeah.
Well, one of the biggest advantages of Bitcoin is that the fact that anybody can use it. Anybody that has a cell phone can effectively have their very own bank account for free. And this allows great opportunities in third world countries where people don't have access to banks, or if the banks they do have access to are sort of just stealing all their money. The second big advantage, which affects pretty much everybody, is that whatever you see on the blockchain, which is where all these cryptocurrencies are based on, it's all viewable and you can't change it. It's immutable. So that provides a level of transparency never seen before in banking systems.
Another thing about Bitcoin is that the exchange rates are very low compared to our traditional currency right now.
If you want to send money, to somebody in, say, Syria, you'd have to exchange it between two currencies plus pay your transaction fees. With Bitcoin or with any sort of cryptocurrency, you can just pay the transaction fee and be done with it. Okay, so Michael mentioned the blockchain earlier. So what is a blockchain?
So the blockchain holds many copies of a single transaction, and that prevents attackers from modifying an entire transaction. So to explain this, let's pretend there's 10 copies of the same transaction, and an attacker finds out one of the transactions is located and will attack that specific value. The blockchain will recognize that a change has been made, and it'll run an algorithm. And what that will do is it'll say all the current transactions regarding that single transaction, and it'll update the attacked and modified transaction to the previous value. That prevents the transaction from being falsified.
Since every transaction is recorded in the blockchain, we actually have a way of tracing back to see every transaction that has been made. This actually provides the system with a lot of transparency in that every single transaction made can be tracked back to the person who made it, in theory, as long as we know who the account belongs to.
Yeah, the blockchain is publicly shared, and there are people called miners that get paid to monitor the blockchain. The miners are paid in Bitcoin, which in turn contributes to more Bitcoin currency being generated into the system.
So to understand our first ethical issue, we also need to understand what Ethereum is. Ethereum is a system invented by Vitalik Buterin. It's kind of an extension of Bitcoin in a way, but it has some key differences. The idea behind Bitcoin is a straight exchange of value. I send you Bitcoin, you send me Bitcoin. It's a way of transferring money. But the way that we nowadays deal with money is much more complicated than that, because we're normally dealing with contracts. Say you want to send me money in exchange for my car or my house, or maybe to rent something from me. This isn't possible on Bitcoin the way it is currently implemented. So Ethereum takes a different route and creates what we call smart contracts. Smart contracts are pieces of code that can be written and added to the blockchain. These are very similar to tokens in that they are immutable. Once they're on the blockchain, they can't be changed. The history of them can't be changed. So when you send money, or Ethereum, Ether, to a smart contract, it initiates the smart contract, and then the smart contract will do something in exchange. Now, a smart contract can actually do things like create new tokens, and tokens can represent things in real life with value. For instance, the car or the house. Decentralized autonomous organization. So the idea is that you create an organization on the blockchain that isn't controlled by any single person. So the coders that created the DAO don't actually control the DAO.
Okay.
The DAO makes decisions based on bylaws that are set in stone at the very beginning, and they're immutable. So once the DAO has been created, it follows those rules and uses those rules to organize itself. So what they end up doing is they tend to build these things towards the idea of building some sort of product or software, the same as any other organization. The DAO that we're referring to here is the DAO. It was made to control and organize the development of Ethereum. They wanted to create an organization that would manage it and would be responsible for hiring people that build out the blockchain. So the way that it does that is it hires contractors, and contractors submit proposals to the DAO. Curators are people that are responsible for actually enforcing the bylaws, and they're the ones that choose which proposals are accepted. And when they accept a proposal, the contractor is added to a list of people who can receive Ethereum from the DAO for the work that they do. The other participants in the DAO are people who invest in it. So these are people that, like you or I, who want to have a say in how the DAO works. These people are kind of the same as anyone who buys stocks in a company. So you would send Ethereum to the DAO and receive what's called a DAO token. That gives you a vote, and you can use that to hire or fire the curators. The same as you would elect a board of executives in a company. The problem with the DAO is that it got hacked. There was a bug in the code, and ironically, they actually fixed it, but they hadn't pushed it yet.
Now, what was this bug?
Well, so the bug had a small issue that allowed for infinite recursion to occur in a very specific scenario. A person could send a command to transfer funds, and if they could get the same function to call split DAO, the function that is being called, again, it would infinitely occur and transfer effectively as much money as you want to one location.
Oh my goodness.
And one guy figured that out. Nice little hacker. And he effectively stole the entirety of the balance of the DAO. So this massive organization that was worth a huge amount, a percentage of all of the Ethereum value, was stolen overnight.
Now, how much money in US dollars would that be related to? Would you happen to know?
$55 million.
Oh, wow.
So one person stole $55 million from the DAO. Now, how'd they fix this? Did they ever get the money back?
They tried to. So the maintainers of Ethereum did the mortal sin in all of blockchain. They just simply forked the blockchain.
What's a fork?
Well, that is when you split the blockchain at a certain point in history. You decide that at this point, all the transactions after that are invalid. The way that they did this was you just have to get the miners to agree in consensus that this is the new reality, that these transactions never occurred. The problem was that not all of the miners agreed with that. In fact, close to 40% of the miners didn't agree with that.
Now, why would the miners not agree with that? Their money's been stolen. You'd think that they'd like to have all their money back.
That's true. The problem with that is that the intention behind cryptocurrency is an immutable blockchain and an immutable ledger that can never be rewritten. The only way for it to be rewritten is for the miners to do this. And this set a precedent that things could be, like a blockchain could be hard forked, and that had never happened before. And so people were afraid of that and also didn't want that to be the case. What people in the crypto community call purists. So they insisted on keeping the DAO where it was and giving that money back to the hacker.
So he followed all the rules in the DAO, right? So can he even be considered a hacker, or like is it an exploit more like that?
In a sense, you could argue that he was more of like he was exploiting a clause in a contract. The idea behind Ethereum is that every smart contract is a contract. They're not legally binding in any way, so it's hard to argue that from a legal standpoint. But from the standpoint of this is what people agreed to, they did follow the rules, quote unquote, and they exploited a clause that they found in it and managed to make away with the money.
That's a problem. So in the future, how would anybody prevent this from happening again?
So the easiest way to prevent that is to not create DAOs, or to ensure that DAOs are secure. The real issue that they made when building the original DAO was that they got very ambitious. The entire code base was massive, and it was really hard to maintain, especially since once a contract is out there, it's immutable. So they couldn't update it, save for, like, they could create a new entity of it on the blockchain, but it's hard to actually update the DAO because of the entire idea behind it. Like, the DAO isn't controlled by its creators. It's controlled by itself and its community. So to rewrite scripts on the DAO, it has to be approved. So inherently, DAOs in the future, if they are ever created, need to be simple. All right, so let's analyze the stakeholders in this particular situation. So obviously, the DAO token holders were affected. These are people that invested in the DAO, and they're the ones that lost their money. Everyone on the Ethereum blockchain, anyone that owned Ethereum, was also affected subsequently during the split, even those who didn't buy into the DAO. The hacker is obviously the one that stole the money and later sold some of the money on the original blockchain for a lower amount, but still made away with a decent amount of money. The Ethereum Foundation, which is led by Vitalik Buterin, were the ones that made the decision to fork the blockchain, resulting in the loss of all of the funds for everyone else. The DAO writers were obviously the ones that contributed to and created the DAO, and contractors were people who potentially lost out on work, but also lost out on Ethereum that would have been paid to them if they had already engaged in work. And finally, we have the miners. There are two subsets of miners. There are the miners that decided to continue with the fork. Those continued to work on the Ethereum chain. And there are those that decided to stay with it, the purists, who inevitably caused the complete rift. They're the ones that split the blockchain. They made a decision to continue the old fork. Who was ethically responsible for the hack? What about the loss in currency following the hack? The Ethereum Foundation, who chose to hard fork the blockchain, causing the market to crash? The DAO contributors, who wrote the faulty code? The hacker, who stole the money? The miners, who opted to continue along with the old blockchain and force the hard fork to cause a dip in value? So I think personally that the result in the loss of currency can be chalked up to almost everyone.
Well, I'll ask you this. Who do you think is the most responsible for this? Because I personally think the hacker is, for this specific instance, the most responsible.
I think in some sense the DAO contributors are very responsible for the results of this. If you look at it from the perspective of utilitarianism, they did write the code, and they might have intended well, but they resulted in a bug that caused the actual hack to be able to occur in the first place. If they had followed their responsibility and kept the project simple before developing extra rules, they might have prevented this entire thing from occurring.
Okay, but I'll say this. If you look at this through a Kant kind of perspective, it's undoubtedly the hacker's fault. He had ill intent to the entire community, because this affected everybody. It's affected Ethereum, the blockchain, everybody lost their money as well. So I would definitely say the hacker was very immoral in this case.
So let's consider the loss of currency in general. In this case, I believe that the Ethereum Foundation was responsible for the reduction in currency. They clearly intended well, but once again, following the theory of utilitarianism, they forced a fork in the blockchain, breaking their own rules, and this actually resulted in a loss of more money than was actually stolen by the hacker. This choice affected not just the DAO contributors who had already lost their money, but also affected everybody in the Ethereum network, including those who had no intention of or support for the DAO.
Okay, but we can also pretend that the DAO was sort of like a government organization because they have sort of undisputed control. And if we look through a Hobbes kind of perspective, then it's not a moral action because it was the government kind of looking out for their citizens in a sense.
This is true. I also think then that we can look at it from Locke's perspective, in that the government control should be restricted to that of protecting the rights of citizens. By forking the blockchain, they actually forwent the rights of their the positive rights of their citizens, and in order to secure the funds for the DAO contributors, they actually forced the entirety of the community to lose their money.
So I guess to close this, it's a very split argument. There's no clear person that is 100% responsible for this, and the blame can be shared across multiple people, the hackers and the DAO in general.
Ethereum is made with the understanding that each smart contract is effectively a contract. Does this mean, then, that the hacker was simply taking advantage of a clause in a contract?
I think he had ill intent. He clearly wanted the money for himself, but at the same time, everybody should have been following the DAO a lot more carefully. In the end, it was probably more up to the DAO to make sure that their code was up to par.
I feel the hacker knew that he was taking away from something that's not his and taking away something that was allotted for somebody else, and so in that case
he is following the rules, and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, but I think according to some philosophies, even though you're following the rules, if it's wrong, it's wrong.
That's true.
I think looking at it from the perspective of utilitarianism, while he did take advantage of the smart contract, I do think that he actually, as a result, found insecurities in the DAO and forced the community as a whole to look at what they were attempting to do. Prior to this moment, they had a lot of trust that a smart contract would always operate as they expected. And since there is a written word component to each contract, it's hard for people to recognize that they do also have to consider the code. And since the code was so complex that it allowed for something like this to occur, it kind of almost, the $55 million that he stole could almost be considered a sort of finder's fee for having exposed this crack, this bug.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess for this kind of perspective, it depends on the time frame you're giving this. If you're just giving a very small time frame between when the attack actually happened and maybe a month afterwards, then you would say that the hacker is disservicing everybody,
Mm-hmm.
because he's effectively ruined the DAO and created a rift in the Ethereum community.
Mm-hmm.
But if you, with a longer time frame, you potentially saved money, as the DAO would only grow larger and larger, and more money would be invested into it for a hack to eventually happen, because it will eventually happen. Someone will find an issue like this.
Since the collapse of the original DAO, there have been several other attempts to create new DAOs. As computer scientists, how might we improve the situation for future DAO implementations?
Well, I'd definitely say you have to make sure the code is very, very well tested. Give a larger time for testing the DAO. I believe the DAO only had about 3 months between its insurgence and between the hack, and then that's when the bug was found out. So you give a larger time for testing, and always be aware that there could be errors in the code. That's very important to realize.
I think also that we need to focus more on standard best practices, such as the single responsibility principle. The idea being that any piece of code should realistically only do one thing. The DAO attempted to do a lot, and even though it could have been tested better, it did ultimately attempt to do a lot. And since this was an unprecedented attempt, it almost seems as though they were attempting to do too much simultaneously and probably could have kept these codes simpler. I think in the future, DAOs may prefer to focus exclusively on payments and accepting payments, as opposed to focusing so much on allowing universal contribution.
So I think that the Ethereum organization should have had more oversight over the DAO and not have trusted things to go right all the time.
The next major disaster to strike the cryptocurrency world was Mt. Gox. Mt. Gox used to be the world's largest Bitcoin exchange based in Tokyo. At its peak popularity, the platform held about 80% of the world's Bitcoin's transfers. Years later, Mt. Gox came crashing down in a spectacular failure of legal lawsuits and alleged hackers who were skimming money off the site for years. It was reported that 850,000 Bitcoins went missing in February 2014 by an unknown attacker. At a later date, 200,000 were found, but the remaining Bitcoins were still missing to this day. At first, it may seem like hackers were responsible for this failure, but that is misleading. The inner workings of the exchange was a complete mess, which was directly related to the carelessness and incompetence of the former CEO, Mark Karpelès. The exchange was attacked by hackers once before in June 2011, and the response to this attack was to shrug it off and kind of ignore it while working to get the site back online. The code behind the company itself was a complete mess. There was no version control software or testing environment for a long time. This has the potential to devolve into a complete mess, which likely contributed to the initial attack. Later on, Mt. Gox faced a lawsuit of $75 million from CoinLab and had $5 million seized from the U.S. bank account as the company was not registered as a money transmitter. On top of this, U.S. customers had to wait for months on end to withdraw money. During this, the CEO set his sights on a new project, which was a Bitcoin cafe. The CEO would often distract himself with small projects and ignore major issues that the company faced. This carelessness resulted in jail time for the CEO, and the company came crashing to the ground, losing money for the users and dropping the value of Bitcoin as a whole. So, who was responsible for the Mt. Gox disaster? Now, I personally feel like Mark Karpelès was the most responsible for this disaster. He had a very aloof kind of feeling to this whole situation as well. He would often just slack off completely and not focus on the current issues that were at hand.
In some sense, from the perspective of, say, Locke, I think that the citizens, or in this case, the users of the system, had a bit of more of a personal responsibility to understand that they also have to respect their own rights or to protect their own freedoms. They trusted a third party with an exorbitant amount of money, and realistically, since the system is designed to make each person responsible for their own money, they should have kept their currency in their own wallet.
That's very true, but at the same time, hackers were skimming off money from the Mt. Gox for years, and they never reported this. It was only until they actually became insolvent when the customers realized, hey, they can't pay us our Bitcoins anymore, and that's when all hell broke loose.
From a Hobbes perspective, the people were responsible because the government has the right to do whatever they want, and if the king messes up and causes death and despair, that falls on the people for having given up their rights to the governing body. So in this case, the people made the choice to surrender their security to Gox, so the founder was well within his right to do what he wished with all of their funds.
As a utilitarianism perspective, I feel like Mr. Karpelès was very responsible for this, just because everybody but him got let down. He simply paid 6 months in Japanese prison for fraud, afterwards became a billionaire.
Yeah, I agree with you, Michael. I think that he should be held responsible. I think with the Hobbes theory is, yeah, we shouldn't trust on the governing body, but if the governing body is cheating or being unlawful, then the governing body is at fault. I think if he had good intentions, but things didn't work out well, then it would be a different scenario.
Kant would say, you cannot lie, and he was obviously lying. Their hackers were targeting them for years,
He was using
and they never told anybody until the very end.
he was using people as an
Yep.
ends to a means.
Yep. He got rich, and everybody else got poorer.
So I agree with you, Michael. I think that in this case, the governing bodies had ill interest in mind and did not serve the greater good for the greater amount of people, and therefore should be held accountable. Under Locke's theory, this is where the government fails the people.
If you were the CEO, what would you have done instead?
I think I would follow suit with existing or current exchanges like Poloniex, which currently maintains the majority of funds being traded in all cryptocurrencies. Potentially not as much as Mt. Gox once held, but quite a bit. They have played the long game and have since profited significantly more, bringing in a huge percentage of transaction fees from every transaction ever made. They gave more freedom to the people, and they focused more on providing a technology platform as opposed to building a corrupt company.
But would you rather play the long game, or in the span of 3 months get rich?
I personally would feel that in terms of living a virtuous life, I would not take the money.
Now, looking through this with Kant's perspective, you should not be building your Bitcoin cafe when your company's in crisis, or being super proud that your cash register. Utilitarianism perspective. Again, he screwed over a lot of people. And again, it's very much a time frame kind of issue. In the short time, yes, he definitely did a bad thing. But now, ever since Mt. Gox, a lot of other Bitcoin exchanges have opened up. At the time, Mt. Gox was the only Bitcoin exchange in the world. But now there's plenty of them. There's international, national Bitcoin exchanges. So this prevents this kind of corruption, or at least limits the amount of damage this kind of corruption will have again.
Yeah, I agree in terms of utilitarianism. I feel like because new type of internet currencies came out of this, it kind of provided for a better service.
As a computer scientist, how would you improve this situation?
As a computer scientist, I think that the easiest way to prevent this would have been to focus more on providing quality service, and potentially to have even just not done this until it was ready. I think that the wallet technology, that although it was slightly primitive at the time, it wasn't completely unusable, and by forcing people to have responsibility for themselves, we might have prevented this from collecting so much.
As mentioned previously, there was no version control software early on, and there was no testing environment early on, so any changes made are instantly seen by all the users, which is a very, very bad idea, especially when you're dealing with this many people. So they should have definitely had their code up to standard, or their tools up to standard. And the CEO as well, he rewrote the backend from the site that he originally bought, and apparently it was a complete mess as well. So it's really, as a computer scientist, make sure you have some sort of standardization, follow best practices, and have proper tools in place.
Another ethical issue surrounding Bitcoin was that of Silk Roads. Now, what is Silk Roads? Silk Roads was a digital marketplace for illicit trade for illegal goods such as drugs, fake driver's license, and banknotes, and at one point even weapons, but this was actually terminated due to a lack of revenue. It operated over the dark web, therefore hiding the identities of users in at least 10 countries. Further, Bitcoin was used to act as a form of a traceless method of payment. The site operated from 2011 to 2013, racking up $1 billion in sales. A statement from the FBI states that, while in operation, Silk Road was used by thousands of drug dealers and other unlawful vendors to distribute hundreds of kilograms of illegal drugs and other unlawful goods and services to more than 100,000 buyers, and to launder hundreds of millions of dollars deriving from these unlawful transactions. The founder of the website was a 29-year-old material science Texan by the name of Ross Ulrich. In 2013, Ulrich was arrested and charged with conspiracy of drug trafficking, as well as a separate charge for claiming he had planned to murder 5 of his employees. The latter was actually later refuted in court. The bust came down when authorities uncovered chat logs where Ulrich, under the name of Dead Pirate Roberts, allegedly arranged for his site administrator, Curtis Green, to be beaten up and have all his Bitcoin currency stolen, resulting in the death of Curtis Green. It later turns out that the murder of Curtis Green was a hoax by 2 of the prime investigators, Sean Bridges and Carl Force, who with Curtis Green staged the death and took photos of Curtis's body. Sean Bridges and Carl Force were charged with reportedly stealing $800,000 worth of Bitcoins from the Silk Road revenue and from the investigation funds. They used knowledge that was provided to them throughout the investigation to hack into Silk Road and its chat logs. Despite the strange twists and turns of this case, Ross Ulrich now serves a sentence without parole. U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara's opinion on his case is quoted to be, Ulrich was a drug dealer and a criminal profiteer who exploited people's addictions. Judge Catherine B. Forrester insisted a severe sentence was necessary to send a clear signal to others. There must be no doubt that lawlessness will not be tolerated. There must be no doubt that you cannot run a massive criminal enterprise and, because it occurred over the internet, minimize the crime committed on that basis. Ulrich told the court, I wanted to empower people to make choices in their lives and have privacy and anonymity. Prosecutors linked sales on Silk Road to 6 overdoses, one of which was as young as 16 years old. One of the overdoses was said to have been found in front of his computer, logged onto the Silk Road website. So who is ethically responsible? Should Ross be held responsible for the loss of lives of individuals who overdosed on drugs purchased through his website? Is Ross directly responsible for people that died?
I think that the people who were willing to go that far, to join the dark web, to buy Bitcoin, and to access the site to buy the drugs would probably have tried to find their fix some other way. Mm-hmm. And they would probably have been dumb enough to overdose on their own regard.
Yeah, and what I've heard about users from the website is they claim that it was a much safer way to purchase drugs. They're not exposing themselves to a dangerous situation, encountering someone that could be potentially life-threatening. Also, the website was fairly moderated, so if there was a vendor that was fake or was selling fake drugs, that they would remove the vendor. And it had like a customer service support, and like a wide range of users found it a safer way to get what they would get anyway.
Okay, well, I'm also going to say one last thing here. I really think this is a law versus a morality kind of issue. Lawfully, he was a drug dealer, a massive drug dealer, and he got rich off it. Mm-hmm. But if you're just looking at this to morality, he provided a safer opportunity for people that wanted to do illegal drugs. That was his main goal, a safe way to obtain these drugs.
Mm-hmm. And reading about him, I know that he was like a very strong libertarianism. He fell under Locke's view, about government not taking such a role. He wanted to provide people with anonymity and privacy to their transactions. And so he just wanted to create a platform for that. I don't think, from what he says, it doesn't sound like he wanted to get rich off people's despair or their addictions. He wanted to provide a service that he thought would be good for them. And family members know him as a young individual who is...
Look at his intent. His intent was all that mattered right here. If you're looking at this through a kind of perspective,
according to him, which we won't know what it is.
According to him, mm-hmm. But let's take it at face value. He wasn't doing anything wrong under Kant's kind of methodology. He wasn't using anybody. Didn't use them as a means to an end. Good intent. Didn't lie to anybody.
Mm-hmm.
I think from the perspective of utilitarianism, it depends on how you look at it and how the statistics might have worked out. People obviously buying drugs on their own might have overdosed on their own, but it also might have made it easier for people to have gotten hold of it.
Because it's anonymous, because they know where to get it. They don't have to search for it.
Well, it's just easier.
It's online.
Look at Amazon. Amazon
they said and they said that the way that it was the way that Silk Road's the website was pretty much like Amazon. You scroll down to your drug of choice, and you could just click and purchase. So that might actually make it easier. Like they mentioned the case of the young individual who had overdosed and he was found laying on his keyboard with the Silk Road's website. It might have been easier for him to purchase drugs.
So I think
as someone who went to high school and drugs were really popular, it's not hard to find them.
Okay.
There were a lot of people that were doing drugs fairly often. If you really wanted to find drugs, it's not the hardest thing in the world.
I mean, from the perspective of someone who was kind of just a nerd in high school, I knew about the Silk Road, but I had no idea who could have sold me drugs. If I had really wanted to find drugs, I probably would have wound up on the dark web.
Okay, but also from a utilitarianism perspective, was this helping the people actually buying the drugs? You have to ask yourself, is allowing people that wanted drugs to get drugs more beneficial to everybody else, or is it harmful? And I think in this case, it depends who's getting the drugs in the end. If you're delivering to a lot of children, and the majority of the people that are on the website are children, then that shouldn't be taking drugs safely. Bad. But if the majority of people were just adults and they knew how to properly do the drugs without harmful side effects, good. You're providing a safe way for them to acquire drugs.
Prosecutors compare Silk Road to the likes of traditional drug trafficking, but users of the website claim it was a safe way for addicts to purchase drugs as vendors were regularly moderated. Do you think Ross should be tried the same way as traditional drug dealers?
I think that while he did vet his dealers, it's very similar to the way that drug kingpins work in real life. They're going to try to find what they consider to be the best dealer, and they're really just finding people to traffic the drugs regardless. I think he provided a scalable way for people to sell something that was illegal.
Perfectly said. I really don't.
Well, what I think is that I think he should be tried the same way. I think the service is the same, and the content that he is providing is illegal.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that the dark web and the bitcoins are unmoderated, but we still have to abide by the laws of the government.
Yeah, also, one last to mention, he was making a profit all this, and he definitely knew what was going on this site.
Mm-hmm.
You can't claim innocence or ignorance on this matter.
Yeah. Since the collapse of the Silk Road, several other sites that are similar have sprung up. How might we as computer scientists stop this? Can we? Is there another solution?
Well, I'll say, I really don't think as a computer scientist looking on the outside of one of these sites we can do anything about this. This is more of a legal matter. It's about drugs versus getting drugs, or the people that are taking drugs.
Mm-hmm.
In some sense, I think that by perhaps completely reforming our drug laws, eliminating all legal ramifications for consuming drugs, and
or select
creating
drugs at least.
Select drugs, and creating a similar platform that's well governed and well managed, we could actually potentially reduce the number of overdoses caused by people consuming other drugs by accident, as opposed to what they think that they're consuming.
So are you saying that we should have Amazon for drugs?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Okay. But what if we're looking at the inside? How would this change if we were one of the people in the actual startups for one of these drug companies, distributors? How would that change as a computer scientist?
I think perhaps making Bitcoin pooling an option in order to increase the security and privacy so that they could never be traced at all.
So so what you're saying right now is just hide. If you're gonna do this,
Complete anonymity.
just make sure no one can ever find you. And I don't think that's a good idea.
I
That's way
think
too much stress.
As a computer scientist, I would have used Monero, which is totally private, as opposed to using Bitcoin, which is traceable.
Oh, I think Shadow is also something that's completely private as well, which you could use if you wanted to. I guess.
Yeah.
What do you say?
Well, for me, I don't think that selling drugs is right. So.
But you're not selling drugs. You're providing a platform for people to sell drugs.
You know, I still feel like they're illegal substances.
There is nothing wrong with making an honest living by selling illegal drugs.
Yeah, I feel like that's not an honest living just because you can get like a lot of youth involved that are curious about it, and I just feel like people who do this kind of thing need therapy and other kinds of services. I don't know if there could be like, I mean, there is a needle exchange program now in terms of online and people getting drugs in turn for Bitcoin in the future. What's to say that they'll be using the drugs for themselves? But because obviously there's so many sites that are springing up, there is a need for this, and there might always be. Like, I'm just wondering if there's a way to regulate it so that it's safe.
Now, how does this relate to being a computer science student?
Well, I think in terms of having it as a regulated legal platform somehow.
So not
like,
so much as a computer science student, but we're looking more as just a law, change of laws in general. I take it.
Okay.
Are you talking about moderation then?
Yeah, some sort of moderation from legal parties.
So including legal parties in the construction of said site and using them as moderators.
Yeah.
Yes.
I also think that one solution that did actually occur subsequent to Silk Road was the creation or the intention, the forced regulations that made it so that distributors of Bitcoin, such as like Coinbase, are now required to accept government ID before they sell it. This actually increases the ability for government officials and police to track where the money is coming from and where it's going, which could potentially increase reduce the amount of anonymity and potentially make sites like this harder to operate.